Russia's negotiation window now closed, too late to compromise. Let me start with a date that should have set off alarms across Washington, London, and Brussels, but instead slipped by with barely a whisper in the Western. June 14, 2024. That was the day Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, in a closed-door meeting with African leaders in Moscow, delivered a line that should have been treated as a diplomatic earthquake. He didn't shout it. He didn't pound the table. He simply said, in that measured, almost bored tone of "the time for compromise has passed." Now, if you're reading this in the West, you probably didn't hear about it. And if you did, you were told it was just more of the same Russian bluster, propaganda, the usual posturing. But here's the I've spent the last 40 years studying Russian strategy, from the Cold War to the present. I've advised generals, briefed Congress, and watched Moscow's playbook evolve in real time. And when Lavrov says something like that, it's not bluster. It's a statement of fact. The negotiation window didn't just narrow in June, it slammed shut. And yet, in Washington, the response has been a mix of denial and delusion. The White House still talks about off-ramps. NATO officials whisper about diplomatic solutions. The media runs stories about how Putin is weak and Russia is running out of steam. But none of that aligns with what's actually happening on the ground, in the intelligence briefings, or in the private conversations I've had with people who know better. So let's cut through the noise. Because what's unfolding right now isn't just another phase of the Ukraine war, it's the death rattle of an era in which the United States could dictate terms to the world. And we're not prepared for what comes in. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story you've been: Russia is losing. Badly. The Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023 failed, but only because of Western delays in sending weapons. If we just send more ATACMS, more F-16s, more long-range missiles, Ukraine can still push Russia back to the 1991 borders. Putin is desperate. His economy is on the brink. His military is exhausted. And if we hold firm, he'll eventually come to the table on our terms. That's the version you get from the State Department, from NATO press releases, from the New York Times and BBC. It's a clean the plucky underdog versus the bully, with the West as the noble benefactor. And it's backed up by some compelling data. The IMF says Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, but that's misleading. Sanctions have crippled high-tech sectors, and the ruble has collapsed. The West's financial war is working. Military: the UK Ministry of Defence estimates Russia has lost 500,000 troops since 2022. Ukrainian intelligence claims 70,000 Russian soldiers were killed in 2023 alone. Even if those numbers are inflated, the trend is Russia is bleeding. Diplomatic: the UN General Assembly voted 141-7 to condemn Russia's invasion. Only a handful of pariah states, North Korea, Syria, Iran, stand with Moscow. Ukrainian: despite setbacks, Ukraine has held the line. Zelensky's government remains defiant. The West's support, while delayed, is still flowing. On paper, it looks like a war of attrition that Russia can't win. And if you believe that, then the logical conclusion is keep the pressure on, and eventually, Putin will cave. Maybe he'll settle for a frozen conflict. Maybe he'll be overthrown. But one way or another, the West will prevail. But there's a problem with this narrative. It ignores three critical. 1. Russia isn't fighting just Ukraine, it's fighting NATO. 2. The West's strategy is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Russian resolve. 3. Time is not on our side. Let me explain. Deconstructing the what's really happening. 1. Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine, it's fighting NATO. Here's the first inconvenient: Ukraine is a NATO proxy in everything but name. I've seen the intelligence reports. I've talked to officers on the ground. The reality is that Ukraine's military is now fully integrated into NATO's command structure. American and British officers aren't just advising, they're calling the shots. The HIMARS strikes? Planned in Stuttgart. The F-16 training? Run by the Pentagon. The long-range ATACMS attacks on Crimea? Targeted by U.S. intelligence. This isn't speculation. In February 2024, the Washington Post ran a piece detailing how the US is now directly approving Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. That's not support, that's co-belligerency. And Russia knows it. Now, why does this matter? Because Russia has never treated this as a war with Ukraine alone. From day one, Moscow has framed this as an existential conflict with NATO. And every time the West crosses another red line, sending tanks, then long-range missiles, then F-16s, Russia's response gets more extreme. In March 2024, Putin gave a speech where he said, "We are at war with NATO. Not Ukraine. NATO." And he wasn't being hyperbolic. He was stating a fact that Western leaders refuse to acknowledge. 2. The West misunderstands Russian resolve. The second problem with the official narrative is that it assumes Russia will eventually break under pressure. That's a dangerous assumption. Let me tell you something about Russian strategy that most Western analysts get. Russia does not fight wars the way we do. The US enters conflicts with clear exit strategies. We calculate costs, weigh public opinion, and pull out when the political pain becomes too great. Russia? They fight until they win or until they're destroyed. Look at Napoleon's invasion. Russia burned Moscow rather than surrender. World War II, the USSR lost 27 million people and still won. Afghanistan, the Soviets bled for a decade before withdrawing, but only after achieving their strategic goals. Now, compare that to the US in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. We left when the body bags piled up and the polls turned. Russia doesn't operate that way. And here's the Russia's economy isn't collapsing. Yes, sanctions hurt. But Russia has adapted. They've rerouted trade through China, India, and the global south. Their military-industrial complex is running at full capacity. And critically, they're outproducing the West in artillery, drones, and missiles. In 2023, Russia produced over 2 million artillery shells. The US and Europe combined? Less than 1 million. That's not a war of attrition, it's a war of industrial capacity, and Russia is winning. 3. Time is not on our side. The third flaw in the Western narrative is the assumption that delay works in our favor. It doesn't. Every day that passes, Russia digs in deeper. They're fortifying the front lines. They're integrating occupied territories. They're extending their military production. And critically, they're preparing for a long war. Meanwhile, the West is running out of ammunition, political will, and time. The US is out of shells. The Pentagon has admitted that America's stockpiles are dangerously low. We're sending Ukraine what we can, but we're not replacing it fast enough. Europe is divided. Hungary, Slovakia, and even France are wavering. The EU's promised 1 million shells by 2024? They've delivered less than 30%. Ukraine's manpower is dwindling. Zelensky has lowered the draft age to 25. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. The US election is looming. If Trump wins in November, Western support for Ukraine could collapse overnight. Russia knows this. That's why they're not negotiating. They're waiting. And when the West's resolve cracks, which it will, they'll be ready to dictate terms. The geopolitical why this war is bigger than Ukraine. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of global power. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a simple "we are the sole superpower, and the world must accept our rules." That's what we call liberal hegemony, the idea that democracy, free markets, and American leadership should dominate the planet. But here's the Russia and China never accepted that order. And now, they're actively dismantling it. The rise of the multipolar world. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the West assumed the world would rally behind us. But it didn't. Instead, most of the planet stayed neutral. China has backed Russia economically and diplomatically. India is buying Russian oil at record levels. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are playing both sides. Africa and Latin America are increasingly aligning with Moscow and Beijing. This isn't an accident. It's the result of decades of US overreach. We bombed Libya and left it in chaos. We invaded Iraq on false pretenses. We exited NATO to Russia's borders despite promises not to. We weaponized the dollar, freezing Russia's reserves and cutting them off from SWIFT. And now, the global south is if the US can do this to Russia, what's stopping them from doing it to us? The answer? Nothing. And that's why countries are hedging their bets. The new cold US versus China versus Russia. This isn't just a regional conflict. It's the opening act of a new Cold War, one that's far more dangerous than the last. China is watching closely. If Russia wins in Ukraine, Beijing will be emboldened to take Taiwan. Iran and North Korea are supplying Russia with drones and missiles, creating a de facto anti-Western alliance. The US is stretched thin. We're supporting Ukraine, containing China, and managing crises in the Middle East. We can't do it all. And here's the US is losing. China's GDP is on track to surpass ours by 2030. Russia and China are outproducing us in key areas. The global south is drifting away from the West. This isn't just a setback. It's a fundamental shift in global power. Military: why the West can't win this war. Now, let's talk about the military situation. Because the hard truth is the West cannot defeat Russia in Ukraine. I've seen the classified assessments. I've talked to generals who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the conclusion is this war is unwinnable under current conditions. 1. The front lines are frozen. Since the failure of Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, the front lines have barely moved. Russia has dug 3 layers of trenches, laid millions of mines, and built concrete fortifications that make the Western Front of World War I look like a speed bump. Ukraine doesn't have the manpower or firepower to break through. And even if they did, Russia has reserves. They've mobilized 300,000 plus troops since 2022. They can keep this up for years. 2. The West is running out of weapons. Here's a fact that should terrify the US: has no more 155mm artillery shells to give Ukraine. We've sent over 2 million shells since 2022. Our stockpiles are depleted. And our production? We're making 28,000 shells a month. Russia is making 100,000. The same goes for drones, missiles, and air defense systems. We're sending Ukraine what we can, but we're not replacing it fast enough. 3. Ukraine is running out of soldiers. Ukraine started this war with a population of 41 million. Today, millions have fled. The draft age has been lowered to 25. And despite that, Ukraine is struggling to find new recruits. In February 2024, Zelensky admitted that Ukraine needs 500,000 more troops. But where are they going to come from? The country is running out of men. 4. Russia is winning the war of attrition. Here's the brutal. Russia can lose 50,000 men a month and still keep fighting. Ukraine can't. Russia can produce 100,000 artillery shells a month. The US and Europe combined can't match that. This isn't a stalemate. It's a slow-motion Russian victory. The domestic political why Washington can't admit defeat. Now, let's talk about why the US keeps doubling down on a losing strategy. The answer? Politics. 1. The 2024 election is looming. Biden's team knows that if they admit Ukraine is losing, it will hurt them in November. So they're lying to the American people. They say Ukraine is winning. They say Russia is collapsing. They say just a little more aid will turn the tide. But it's not true. And the American people are starting to notice. 2. The blob won't let go. Washington's foreign policy establishment, the so-called blob, has staked its reputation on Ukraine. Admitting defeat would mean admitting they were wrong. So they keep pushing for more weapons, more sanctions, more escalation. Even if it leads to direct war with Russia. 3. The military-industrial complex is profiting. Here's a dirty little: the defense industry loves this war. Lockheed Martin's stock is up 50% since 2022. Raytheon's profits have surged. The Pentagon's budget is at record highs. And the longer the war drags on, the more money they make. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1: Frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds to a halt in 2024. Ukraine holds the line. Russia can't advance. The West keeps sending just enough aid to prevent collapse. A Korean-style stalemate, with a DMZ along the current front lines. This only works if both sides accept it. Russia won't. They want total victory. Scenario 2: Russian breakthrough. This is the most likely outcome. Russia launches a major offensive in 2024-25. Ukraine's defenses collapse. The West scrambles to send more weapons, but it's too late. Russia takes Kharkiv, Odessa, and possibly Kiev. A humiliating Ukrainian defeat. Zelensky flees. A pro-Russian puppet government takes over. Scenario 3: Direct NATO-Russia war. This is the nightmare scenario. Ukraine collapses. The US and NATO intervene directly. Russia responds with tactical nukes. World War III. Now, I know that can't happen. No one would be that stupid. I wish I could agree. But I've seen the intelligence. I've talked to the generals. And the reality is the blob is pushing us toward disaster. Grand strategy: why the US is losing the 21st century. Let's step back for a moment. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of American power. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a flawed grand liberal hegemony. The idea that we can reshape the world in our image through military force, economic pressure, and regime change. It hasn't worked. A disaster. A disaster. A disaster. A disaster. And now, Ukraine is shaping up to be the biggest disaster of all. Why? Because we've forgotten the first rule of great power: you can't win every fight. The US is overstretched. We're trying to contain China, manage the Middle East, and now fight Russia in Ukraine. It's unsustainable. And the worst part? We're doing it alone. Europe won't defend itself. Japan and South Korea are hedging. The global south is drifting toward China and Russia. This is not a recipe for success. It's a recipe for decline. What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? Realism. We need to accept that we can't control the world. We need to pick our battles. And most importantly, we need to stop fighting unwinnable wars. Here's what that looks. 1. End the war in Ukraine. Negotiate a ceasefire now. Before Russia takes more territory. Accept that Ukraine won't join NATO. It's a non-starter for Russia. Offer sanctions relief in exchange for peace. 2. Pivot to China. Ukraine.